Okay, so now for the amusing part of the talk. And that's the other handout. The first page is just the semantics of the root. But then I would like to talk a little bit about a very obscure English element. I don't want to call it a prefix because native speakers aren't aware that it has any particular meaning right now. So let's call it a preformative. And coincidentally, the reason I picked this is because coincidentally, the form is a. And everybody knows, all historians of the English language know, that this preformative comes from an old English locative morpheme, an or on, with meanings like modern English in or at or on. And this Old English form, an or on, was reduced in medieval and modern English to a. And it has slightly different functions before nouns, or as opposed to before verbs. Before nouns, it occurs with a lot of general words, but also especially with nautical terms, that is, seafaring words. Before verbs, it has a state of meaning or a durative meaning. So look at all these words referring to words that you need when you're sailing the sea. Aback, abaft, abeam, aboard, aground, you run aground. A lee means in the shadow of the wind. Aloft is up in the rigging. A port, a sea, this one is still used. Ashore is still used. Athwart, away. 100% of American children, when they hear the expression anchors away, there was a song, Anchors Away, from World War II. We think it means away, A-W-A-Y. You pull up the anchors, so the anchors are away. But there's an expression to weigh anchor that means the same thing, to pull up the anchor. For some reason it's called to weigh anchor. And this is how it's written. Okay, and then there are notes of these various things. If you're interested, you can, I'll be glad to send you copies of it. Then there are a lot of general locatives. Like about, above, abreast, abroad, across, afar, afield, afoot, against, ahead, along, amid, among. Some aren't used anymore. Around, aside, aslant. Aslant, I find in Hamlet, they're talking about Ophelia. There is a willow grows aslant a brook, which means slanting over the brook. But nobody uses that anymore. So a lot of these are archaic. Can we keep scrolling? Yeah, this is a Scottish word, agley, a famous verse, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang off to gley, often go wrong. Aweary is also appears in Shakespeare. I begin to grow aweary of the sun and wish the estate of the world were now undone. Can you keep going? Yeah. With action verbs, a was used fairly freely. Words like a swim, a swoon, a swing, the act of swimming. And this still exists in some dialects of English. Some older people still use expressions like this. They're considered dialectal. So I'm just a-sitting in the sun, warming my old bones. It has to be used with the progressive form of the verb, with the ing suffix. They were running and shouting like a bunch of lunatics. Another example from Shakespeare in King Lear, when King Lear's beloved daughter Cordelia is being hanged at the end of the play, King Lear actually kills a guy who was trying to hang her, and said, I killed the slave that was a-hanging thee. That was in the act of hanging you. So that's from like at hanging. It was about the act of hanging. So a lot of these expressions are archaic, obsolete, or moribund. So some examples here. We still say a fire, but on fire is now much more common. Atop is kind of literary, on top, we say. A C we can still say, but at sea is more common. Atone, that's interesting. To atone for a sin, that actually comes from at one, in agreement. Asleep, this is still very common. Everybody says asleep. Akin is still used. Allowed is still in common use. A bed, it's quaint now, we say in bed. A bloom is poetic, we say in bloom. A flame we can say, but it's sort of literary, in flames. Okay. Now, another point I want to make is that there are lots of words which begin with ah, which have nothing to do with this particular prefix. Some derive from an intensitive prefix. A lot of words are from Romance languages, especially from French, where the first element is ah, but that has nothing to do with what we're talking about. Yeah, all these things. If you look through the dictionary, you find many, many, many. Some of them look very much like they should be native English. Across, for example, it's one of these spatial things, but it's actually from French, à quoi or en quoi. Afraid is from French, effrayé. Agog, angug, in merriment. Apart, apace, apiece, astray. We even have a word from Malay, amok, to run amok, but that is that's a different story for that. Okay, so now the point I want to make, differences and similarities between these two prefixes, the Proto-Tibeto-Burman one and this English prefix. Both of the prefixal elements, both of these elements can be traced back to the same proto-semantic entity, but this is different in the two cases. In the Tibeto-Burman case, I'd say the proto-semantics is inalienable possession. In English, it's locativity, locative. There are different etymological statuses among the various examples that exemplify the English preformative, so they don't all come from the same source, but I claim that all the morphophonemic variants of the Tibeto-Burman prefix are etymologically related. In the English case, the origin of the preformative is quite clear, comes from at or on, but in Tibeto-Burman, Sino-Tibetan, no independent morpheme can be identified as the form that was reduced to become a. And something which is a total coincidence, both prefixal elements involve nasal variants, though this is entirely coincidental. In the case of English, the nasal final, as in modern English in and on, was there originally, but disappeared in unstressed position. In the Tibeto-Burman case, on the other hand, I claim the nasal element to be secondary, a product of minor glottophilia. A minor point, there's no particular connection with colors in the history of English although this is a crucial semantic category in the case of the Tibeto-Burman prefix, since it has both nominal and verbal characteristics, words for color. Similarities. Both the Tibeto-Burman and the English prefixes have to be reconstructed with stressed and unstressed variants. And in both Tibeto-Burman and English, the pre-nominal use of the prefix seems to have been basic, but in both cases, their usage was widened to include pre-verbal usage as well. And another point they have in common is, once these prefixal elements were well established, they were generalized and could be affixed to loan words as well as to native words. We saw those words from French, which look very much like their native English words. And by coincidence again, both the Tibeto-Burman and the English prefixes have affinities to the notion of stativity. Something which is inalienably possessed stays put, and something that has a locative meaning often refers to a more or less permanent position in space. So even though these prefixes have absolutely nothing to do with each other historically, there are interesting similarities and differences between them. I think I'll stop right there. Thank you.